most people, in my experience, want to tell their story, right? Even if nothing ever happens about it, they have this sense of needing to tell it.
Welcome to Reporting the World from the UCB Clinton Institute and the CNN Academy, the podcast that takes you behind the headlines to learn about the industry that creates them. I am Agata Hotkova.
And I'm Sarah Majorana.
Let's get started.
Our guest today is Mei-Ling McNamara, an award-winning investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker whose work has exposed some of the darkest hidden realities of our time. She's also the editorial director of Investigative Europe, leading cross-border investigations that hold the powerful to account and connect the dots on Europe. Mei-Ling, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I would like to ask you, in your career, you conducted groundbreaking investigation. You worked with the New York Times, the CNN, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, but can you tell us about your journey? How did it start?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of have a philosophy that, you can train, when you're younger in journalism, but sometimes, life experience is the best trainer. And for me, I studied English literature as an undergrad, but I actually was able to have a lot of experiences working abroad, working with a lot of international people, and really, on the ground kind of experiences, in Africa, in Asia, all over Europe, and of course in the United States. And I think it really helped, me to really understand really what journalism is best at, which is how to speak to people, how to listen, um, and really to be able to connect kind of what the powerful are doing to impact, right? Those who have less of a voice. And so I think that kind of life experience or the many life experiences I had really brought me to this profession.
But what drove you to go specifically into documentary and investigative journalism?
I think that's a great question. I think there's been a few really critical experiences that I had, and I would actually say when I worked in Africa for about 7 years, and part of that time I worked in some of the most impoverished places for British charities and other organizations working in community radio. And one of those places was Madagascar, and I worked in the southern part of Madagascar, which was incredibly, incredibly poor, and spent quite a few years there. And really, what I witnessed there, working with communities and obviously doing radio was hugely valuable. But I also witnessed the most like abject circumstances people found themselves into. And as much as I looked into sort of environmental issues or community issues, I realized that there was a common thread. And this is really this lack of human rights, this lack of agency, and this real inequality, in the world. And so that was a real formative experience for me to see that families can't get even basic medical care, and cannot even travel into a smaller city to even receive any medicine. And their child can die of encephalitis, right? Um, I also had another really formative experience actually as I'm speaking. I remember as when I was young, I had a very good friend from Brazil when I was in kind of high school in America. And she invited me to come and stay with her when I was 18. And I saved up some money when I was in my first year in college. And I went to Sao Paulo in Brazil by myself for the first time.
Was
And
it your first time traveling abroad in
I
general?
had traveled to Mexico at a very young age and all over the United States, but my family was a family of teachers. We didn't have a ton of money. We had a lovely camper van, and we did a lot of traveling, and I met a lot of great people. So I did have a lot of exposure in the United States, but outside, not so much.
I see.
So I saved up and I went abroad, and I remember very, very, very clearly in the plane as we were landing, I looked out the window and I saw just miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers of cardboard that looked like homes, homes made of cardboard and corrugated iron. And I had never seen that like large sort of area of kind of, I don't know what this was, right? Sort of, was it housing or was it a junkyard? And when I met my friend, I asked her, and she said, "No, those are favelas. Those people live there." And I remember being so shocked, not because of poverty, but because of such volume of poverty in a country, and it really shook me at a very young age. And I think these kind of experiences, I think of seeing this kind of poverty and really understanding and living next to people with such inequality, drove me to this idea that with experience in communication, writing, um, you know, kind of written communication, verbal communication, and also visual communication, which I loved, I might be able to help potentially reset the balance of power, right? So these were the kind of
Yes.
experiences I had, that I think shaped me to be a journalist.
Okay. There was like a specific moment in which like you realize, okay, I want to like to tell the story of these people, like when you
Mhm.
decide to become an investigative journalist.
Mm. Well, actually, when I left Africa, I decided to go back to training more formally in journalism. I had done quite a bit of writing at the time and radio, as I mentioned. So I went back to London and
Mhm.
I did my master's at Goldsmiths at the University of
Yes.
London. But, it was in print journalism, which I really enjoyed doing, but there was something that also really drove me, and I really felt that I wanted to do documentary investigations. It was just something that was so exciting to me, and I just called up, the top kind of current affairs investigative documentary program called Unreported World that went out on Channel 4, and I said to them, "I wanna work for you." And I think I sent them my CV and, I said, they said, "Well, when can you come in?" And I said, "Well, I can't really come in because I'm studying and I can only do this during my breaks." And they said, "Well, TV doesn't really work like that.
Yes.
Call us back when you're more free." So I thought about it and a few months passed by and then I finally said, "You know what? I'm just gonna call them again." And I called them back and I said, "Look, I'm gonna make this work. I'd love to do a placement with you." And it started from there. And I think, I came quite late, to investigative journalism. I was in my early 30s, and I feel as if I needed all that life experience to really take off, you know?
Okay.
Like,
Yes.
within
Yes.
within that first year, I was already pitching stories, I was getting things broadcast,
Okay. So
and
you
so
really.
it felt very natural for me to be a part of that quite quickly.
But then from that moment, like you just.
Yeah, it just took off. I remember my first story I did with Unreported World, and we're doing a story around Afghanistan and Kabul, and how Kabul was becoming this island in this sea of like radicalism. And I pitched the story, and they took it, and it was exciting. I was a researcher and a kind of assistant producer. And after that, it just felt really exciting. And I had a story. I mean, I had a year before a print story for a different organization in America. I was starting to get into it, and I remember it was around the UNHCR and how they weren't allowing access to refugees within this camp. And I remember hearing that our story got picked up by UNHCR and they responded to it. And it was like catching the bug, And
Yes.
people all talk about it, from that Afghanistan story to this UNHCR story in Uganda. I had this bug that actually something I I did mattered to others.
Yes.
And it really felt very powerful for the first time that you could actually maybe not completely change, but slightly alter the
Yeah.
course of
You have an
events.
impact on that.
Yeah, and for the better, right? To
Yes.
help others. And so that was the bug.
So from the beginning where you realized I actually want to film documentaries because I don't want to be in print, and then you started producing these movies for Channel 4, documentaries for Channel 4, you got all the way to filming the most successful, the most viewed documentary on The Guardian, the Trap documentary. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't against print, let me be clear. It was just at the time, I felt there were many formats that you could tell stories in, and print was one of those, right? Um, yeah, after I worked for a number of broadcasters, for shorter and then longer lengths of time. At Al Jazeera, I was part of the People in Power documentary strand. It was investigative docs, and they were just incredible people. They really mentored me. They really trained me up. I had a wonderful editor. I had a wonderful group of colleagues, and they gave me a lot of excellent opportunities, right, that I might not have gotten in other places. So I was able to produce, I was able to direct, right? So it gave me this confidence. And as a young woman, a biracial woman, it was, Al Jazeera was that kind of place. It really was super inclusive. So when I departed to do my doctorate at the University of Edinburgh, and right when I kind of left Al Jazeera, the Guardian got in touch, and they had seen some of the work I had done at Al Jazeera on children that had been trafficked into cannabis factories. So they asked me to start working on them on some of these stories. And so that's really how my relationship with The Guardian began.
Hmm.
And I started this really great relationship with this editor who her name was Annie Kelly. We worked a lot together on stories. And when I decided to go back to the United States for a while, I started to look into, because my doctorate, a lot of my work, had started to really involve really focusing on exploitation, modern day slavery, trafficking, and I was very interested in that topic because how much it intersected with lots of other issues in society, right? About
Yes.
equality, labor
Yep.
issues, migration,
Yes.
um, and human rights. So I started to think about the United States and really what are some of the most who are some of the most vulnerable kind of groups in society. And I really thought about, the incarcerated. And I really started to think about how trafficking is such an easy entry point,
But
right?
how did you find the story of women inside of prisons being
First
trafficked?
of all, I would like to ask you, like, to our because maybe so our listener doesn't understand, like, doesn't know, sorry, about the documentary. So if you can give us like a brief like description of the documentary, what was about, and like, just
Which
like,
one, the trap?
yes,
Specifically, what was it about? And then how did you
Sure, yeah.
find out the
So
story?
so so I started to think about who could be the most vulnerable in society, and I started thinking about, those who are incarcerated. And I started to think about, of course, women and women of color, right? So it was just really a brainstorm. It was just thinking, right? Because I had done a lot of work on trafficking in my doctorate. I had done a huge kind of piece for The Guardian on Bangladeshi men being trafficked into hotels in Scotland. And I started to look and do some research. And what I found was very interesting, right? The first thing that happened was a correctional officer in Florida started to write that he had received lots of letters about women being trafficked. And I started to see that this was actually a case that was taken by law enforcement in Florida. So I thought to myself, these methods used by traffickers could not be the only time,
Mm-hmm.
right? In this
yes,
one
Yep.
instance, right? So I pitched this story to The Guardian, and they basically started to fund research for me to start looking into this in more depth. And what I discovered was that this was a prevalent problem all over the United States, right? And part of this was that people's information was accessible online to
Mm-hmm.
anyone who wanted to
Yep.
do so. And this is how the documentary began. And so it began, and it was called The Trap. And it wasn't just about women being trafficked, but it was about how the system, right, works to criminalize women who are out on the streets, put them back into prisons, where they are then targeted and exploited by often men, sometimes women, when they get out. So it really started to like really look at the structures and systems that allow for exploitation to occur within incarceration.
yes. How was to like interact with these vulnerable people, especially like women? So, like, how yes, you managed like to produce this documentary, and like, I'm interested also like it affect the mental health of you, like how do you interact with them? And yeah, I think it's really like it's really captivating, but it's really really like a also tough topic, and so you can see them like also in the documentary, and it's really yes. I ask myself how I do really manage like to interact with this really vulnerable subject.
It's a great question. Part of journalism is actually putting yourself in other people's a position of other people maybe a life that you've never lived, right? I've never been incarcerated. But, you know, when you're a child, you read stories and you are in those characters' lives, right? But suddenly now these are real people's lives you're talking about, real people that have gone through these things. And if you're an empathetic person, you put yourself in that position and you try and relate, not to compare notes, of course, but you try to relate to how they could feel, right, in these situations, right? The feelings of vulnerability, the feelings of helplessness, the feelings of feeling trapped, right?
Yes.
And it is not about extraction, right? It's about empathy. And I'm not going to criticize how people do journalism, right? But this is the way I do journalism, right? Is to really try and put myself in that position. So, this was a years long project, probably a full year of filming in many locations, and a lot of time spent in prisons, particularly in
Yes.
Massachusetts. And it was building trust with the women and seeing them out on the streets and then seeing them back in the prison. And after a while, we had some wonderful people who worked with us who had been there, who had gone through that, and who now were out of that system. And were almost just like our Virgil, right? They showed us everything, but they were also a kind of point of trust for the women, right? So they would trust me. But there was a point I remember very clearly where I'd spent about a week inside the prison, about 7 hours a day, and we had
Uh,
amazing access, by the
yes.
way.
Would
Like,
you sleep there as well, or do you go there in
no,
the
no.
morning and come
We'd
back
go
in
in
the
the morning
evening?
and come back in the
Okay.
afternoon, and the women's prison in Chicopee in Massachusetts gave us incredible access and incredible trust, by the way, to allow us to do this, and the women themselves did so as well. But I remember it was the final week of filming and the final day, and I remember just doing this thing called pickups, which is like the remainder of things you need to shoot, right? So
Okay.
you've done
Mhm.
all this filming, and it's the last little bit of pickups. And I remember sitting at a table, and we had done this last kind of interview, and I looked up, and there was a queue of women just all the way down the corridor. And they all wanted to speak to me. They weren't all going to be filmed. They just wanted to speak to me about their experience. So I stayed and I listened to about, I don't know, 7, 8 women, and they kind of took turns and they just wanted to talk to me.
So you've almost got the role of a therapist in the prison,
It was
talking
like it
these
was like a
women.
therapist, but it was almost just like a sounding board, For them, I wasn't their social worker, I wasn't their lawyer, I wasn't their parent. I was like a neutral person that they just wanted to tell their story to. And I think this touches on a really important point, is that most people, in my experience, want to tell their story, right? Even if nothing ever happens to about it, they have this sense of needing to tell it. And even though we may not have filmed them, or if they didn't want or whatever, it was just being there and listening, right? And not judging, right?
Yes.
And they just wanted that, right? I wasn't going to get them anything. I wasn't going to get them out, right? But I just wanted to mention, so when I left, the camera person stayed to do some more shooting, and I sat in the car for about an hour, and I felt just really drained, And
Yes.
then going home was, I think I experienced a form of guilt, a survivor's guilt, uh, going back to a family, going back to a stable life, going back to, an upbringing that was stable. And, of course, that experience or that feeling did not compare to what the women went through, but it just does feel very tough. And the editor that I worked with felt the same. She had done some of that. So yeah, it's a tough gig, but it's very much a public service, right? So,
Yes, yes. And the fact that they trust you, really, like if they want to tell you the story and also after like the shooting and all, I think it's really, really interesting and reaching also. So it's,
and I think, there is a responsibility, right? Not only to the subjects, but also to the journalists that will come after. That if we approach things as an extractive kind of situation, and all we want to do is take from people their stories, treat them as a kind of objectification as a victim, right? The next journalist that comes will not be able to speak to them, right? Because they'll have a wall up, right? So for me, it's very much about, you know, human to human, telling a story and putting myself in the place of, if this happened to me, how would I want to be treated? How would I want someone to speak to me? Not patronizing, not as a zoo exhibit, not as something as an oddity, but actually as a human that went through something. So that's kind of how I see it.
Okay.
That's I really wanted to ask about this because I was just wondering when you're covering difficult topics like this, how do you ensure that you're not just, in and out of people's lives? Like how do you make sure that you approach it sensitively, but you can answer these questions? Um, but I wanted to also ask, do you do any further work with your own mental health to process all of this work for yourself? You said that you felt kind of guilty when you came back to your family. Um,
Yes.
does it stay with you? Like, do you go partially through the trauma with the women, or
Try
um,
to dissociate like from the process.
would you
Let
like?
you all let yourself like
Let's say I
just
would
feel everything.
ever go to similar project. Would you have any advice? Maybe how to
Yes.
approach the situation, I suppose.
So I think it's a two-part question. So your first part was kind of how do I give like a space for someone to tell more of their whole story, right?
Mhm.
And then the second is kind of how do I take care of myself
Yes,
after these?
yes.
So I would just answer the first one, which is, we have the opportunity every time to learn more about people, right? Sometimes people who are already public figures, we can read about them, who've gone through some things, maybe survivors, right? And we have the opportunity to do our homework before we meet them, right? But then also to ask the right questions beyond their victimization, right? Or beyond that particular reason we're going to ask them about, right? And this means that people have, a life arc, right? They don't have none of us are one experience that's happened to us, right? We're many things. People have hopes, they have dreams, they have ambitions, they have lots of other great things going on in their life. Maybe they don't have every great thing going on, but they have other things that they want to do. So it's our role not only to do our homework on them, but also to ask them about those things and to include those things in stories as well, right? That helps the audience see that they're not just this single thing, right? And that allows other people to relate to them too. A person who is a mother, a person who is a daughter, a person who has had a really difficult lot in life because they didn't get to choose their parents or their location or their city, right? And I think when we do that, we create a much stronger connection between the audience and the people that we're trying to tell stories with, right? So I think that's very important. The second thing is I don't want to come off as giving any advice to how anyone should handle interviewing people in difficult circumstances. I think we all know ourselves and the best way. But I would say for myself, there's positives and there's also some challenges. One is that I was a freelancer doing a lot of these stories, and they often lasted for long periods of time. And I wasn't ever offered free mental health support, you know? This isn't to necessarily point fingers at anyone, but is to say that um, I didn't really think about it. And I didn't think that I could get access to it. And maybe I could have, but I don't believe it was ever offered to me. So I would say that's something that really should be taken care of, even if freelancers are working for you. Um, but how do I manage it? I worked on a story recently about Meta, and one of the things that I never wanted to do was work on child trafficking stories. It was
Mm.
something that I really, because I have children of my own as well, and I know how sensitive a person I am, to find myself in really, I mean, excuse me, not just child trafficking, but child sexual exploitation and trafficking. For me, that was just like something that I thought I would find too hard to do. But suddenly I was investigating kind of, Meta, the platforms, sexual exploitation on those platforms. And yeah, I mean, I had to listen to a lot of bad things and I had to hear a lot of bad things. And that was really challenging as well as doing the trap, right? So I think for me, I I do a lot of gardening. um,
Yes.
I spend a lot of time in nature. I spend a lot of time around things that I feel help me, kind of regenerate, right?
Yes. Disconnect a bit,
Yeah,
like.
yeah, but yeah, connect and disconnect at the same time, right? Not make my world only that, but also to realize that there's so much good about the world that we can have control over, right? We can grow things, we can walk in nature, we can, I have a lot of my value system around supporting like you know, nature and our ecological kind of, you know,
Mhm.
mission, to kind of be aware of how we have, like, how we work with nature is, like, as important, right, to me as, like, how we connect in human rights. So all of this is all holistic. So I do that. I take a lot of time out, and, so that's really important, but also just being aware too that, I can't control everything, right? So I can't control the outcome of how we want our stories to be. And whatever happens, I need to do my best. So there were moments when I was doing this meta investigation, where I was so upset about certain things that I'd heard that I felt almost frozen. And I remember hearing some terrible, terrible things that it was like terrible things that you can't unsee weirdly in your mind that you've heard but visualize. And I sat on it for about a week, frozen. And then I decided that the best thing I could possibly do was more interviews and continue the journalism and to see my way through this story all the way out to the other side. And that it really empowered me,
Okay.
you know?
So
Because I felt like I had a role, I
yes,
had a job,
you
and I
want to
had a
continue.
duty. Yes, I had a duty to those people. And that was the driving force. So, you know, it's hard to sit with some of that information, but then you realize that you become a witness and you have a role.
So is this what drives you to do more documentaries, more investigative journalism work? Is it seeing the impact of your work what gives you the power
I
to
think there's
continue?
a mixture. I don't do the work because I expect impact. I do the work because I feel that, you know, I have a public service. This is my public service, right, to the world. And this gives me meaning, right? This gives me a sense of meaning that I'm doing something about things that perhaps other people might not have the ability to do, right? Because that's just their, that's their lives, right? They might not be in a position of power or agency. I feel like a very privileged person. I was able to grow up in a country, right? I grew up in America where I had a lot of opportunities for education. I had the ability to be mobile, um, the ability to speak my mind without fear of incarceration or other violence. Why not have this role to help others? And so I think that's where I feel I'm really suited best. If there's impact, great, you know? But it's a kind of place of no fear, right? So you kind of have to do things and not feel afraid. I think it's exciting to kind of work in a profession where, you can be afraid. There are lots of journalists who live in very, very, very difficult circumstances in countries under threat of death. So I I I understand how hard it is to do this profession in a lot of other places. So I feel that I can't complain, right? I feel like I have a role and I can do this role. And if it has impact, great. Um, but I won't stop, basically.
Yes, you don't want to stop. Can I ask you, but like, how does it feel to see this impact? Because we know that the trap has been like one of the most watched video on the Guardian, and also one of the most watched documentary. But also, we know that, for example, the investigation, the 2-year investigation about Meta, also inspired what we see recently, right? So about like the fact that, for example, the New Mexico jury cited your work and the investigation about social media. So how do you feel like to see this impact and also especially about like, for example, social media and this topic? So how do you feel like to inspire
I feel like
style?
two things really exciting about it is one is sometimes you think when you do this work, it won't necessarily change overnight. It's a slow burn, right? But you hope that you can provide evidence so that other people can take the torch and they can hold people accountable, right?
Yes.
And I think when you do this kind of work, you have to be fearless. You can't see a company or an organization as removed from any accountability. And this felt good. It felt good that they were held accountable for the first time around children and health. And I think that ultimately it gave me a lot of um, trust in the judicial system in America,
Mm-hmm.
which was really exciting. That just felt incredible. And it also felt so wonderful that so many young people might now not have to go through what a lot have gone through on that platform. And that's my hope, right? Is that, the whole point was to say, this is happening. We need to understand why it's happening, and we need to hold whoever's letting this happen to account.
I just want to ask you, like, since you're also like a woman, a mother, also in this, and this stands for the social media about like child trafficking, and how does it feel, and how is to be a woman in this sector, like negatively and positively? So how do you? Because also you're like the editorial leader of like the investigative you. So how does it? What does it mean like to be a woman here in journalism?
So high in the industry.
Yeah, again, not a goal, but I would say the colleagues I work with at Investigate Europe are fantastic. Just really wonderful people all around from all country, many countries across Europe. So I'm incredibly lucky to just work with such collegial people. The industry, yeah, I mean, it's pretty representative of a lot of industries, particularly high status industries where you have the media, right? It's very dominated, right, by men, and not a lot of men of color either. So as a woman, I think it's 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 exciting when you meet other women that are doing what you're doing and that have been doing it for so long, right? And I always see my role in helping all young journalists, including women, really especially women, in warning them like about what they're going to be facing, but also completely encouraging them to do it, right? Because we know that it's a tough field, but if you feel driven, right? And if you feel that, what your value is doesn't lie in what you look like, but lies in what you know, your intelligence, your tenacity, all those skills that it takes to be a journalist, like that's what matters, right? And I think in this kind of really, shallow, often creator world that we're seeing in this mediated world all the time about the focus on how people look and how people present. I think that it's exciting for women to see other women do these sorts of roles, and it's important to be a mentor for that, right? And also, my name being mixed, having a Chinese name, being in a minority is also really important for women to see, right? That
Yes.
you can have these types of jobs. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit of a certain personality. I think it takes a certain personality to do this kind of work, right? Which is you don't really see hierarchy in the same way others. You also kind of don't accept that you can't do something if someone tells you that they have nothing to tell you. But at the same time, I've had a lot of incredible mentors, like men and women, that have helped me along the way, and I think that's where I want to give back.
Okay.
So Sarah and I are both non-native speaker rising
Yes.
journalists, and lots of people who might be listening to us right now might be also from international backgrounds. Maybe there are also female rising journalists. To conclude our podcast, would you have any message for young listeners who are aspiring journalists in the field?
I mean, I think, the fact that you're studying this and the fact that you're interested in this is a win already, right? So I think a lot of young people, particularly Gen Z, but I won't cut out the millennials, really feel a sense of justice, really feel that they, have a lot of things that they inherited, right? Of a world in a lot of challenges and difficulties. And I think it's so important for them to feel empowered, right? To feel that however they want to sort of look at the world in the form of journalism or media matters, right? And I think, the powerful have always wanted people to feel powerless. That's their strategy, right? It's always about never having control. And I think it's an illusion. I think that when you look at a lot of these investigations that I've done, right? A lot of these, systems may seem omnipotent. They may seem that they'll never be held accountable. But I think if you look at a lot of investigative journalism, that's not the case. The powerful always fall, or the powerful are always held to account. And so I want young people to feel that there's a sense of hope, and that if they want to pursue journalism, it's there for the taking. And it might take a different form than maybe 20 years ago, but it doesn't matter. They can do it their way.
Mei-Ling, thank you so much for joining us in our podcast. reporting the world. And to everyone who was listening, thank you for being here with us.
If you enjoyed this episode, join us next time to follow us behind the headlines with people who are really reporting the world.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.